The Lord gave King Eglon the power over the Hebrew children. Moab was very pagan. They worshipped the god called Chemosh. He was human sacrifice, bestiality, incest, divination, passing through the fire, cannibalism, drinking blood, all that. Okay. And it said that God gave Hebrew children over to him because they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Even God's chosen people still are going to be overthrown by people who aren't even part of the covenant, the uncircumcised. We've all heard the saying, like, whose side is God on? But the reality is like, are you on God's side? God doesn't pick sides. He picks himself, and you need to choose him. And so as long as you choose him, no matter where he goes, you're going to be covered. Hi guys, I am back with another reflection as I promised. So today we will be going over the book of Ruth, which actually takes place in the era of the book of Judges. So if you remember, the last video was insane. The book of Judges, I literally could not even explain half the stuff that went on in that era, which is about 300 years, 400 years from Joshua to the Hebrew children actually having a king. If you remember, the Bible tells us that there was no king in the land in those days, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And it was literally a cycle of rebellion against God's commandments, falling into oppression, being overtaken, and being subjected to whatever foreign entities, foreign rule was in power, crying out to the Lord for decades and decades, and then God raising up somebody who's not even an heir to the throne or anything like that. God raising up what is called a judge in that time, is somebody who was proclaiming the word of the Lord, somebody who was truly had an encounter with God, and God told them what their next mission was going to be. And there was different types of people, all different types of people. There was Jephthah, as we remember. Jephthah was from the hood though, okay? Really, really, really from the hood though. And so Joshua, if you remember, was the conquest of Canaan, right? The land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants before the Hebrew children were subjected to slavery under the Pharaoh in Egypt. Hebrew children had multiplied, and so that's where the oppression came from. Moses took the children out of Egypt, the 40 years in the desert, and then Joshua rose up after Moses and became the leader of the Hebrew children. Did the conquest of Canaan. Joshua had passed. Canaan was not all the way fully conquested. Okay, so there was many parts of Canaan that was still inhabited by the Canaanites, which the Canaanites are pagan, definitely polytheist. They believed in human sacrifice, child sacrifice, bestiality, drinking blood, fornication, all these types of things, incest, all types of divination, and what the Bible calls passing through the fire. And the only reason why I bring all these up is because these are things that the commandments of the Lord were against. And the Hebrew children were under the covenant of the Lord, right? The great I am. So this is how they fell into rebellion during Judges. Judges was absolutely just what I said was the Bible, but the rated R version. And you have to read it for yourself in order to truly see the parallels between the book of Judges and what I believe is contemporary society today. So then that's how we get into Ruth. Okay, so you're like, Ruth, like, what's that have to do with all this craziness going on? So Ruth was during the time of the Judges, right? During that 336 years, I believe, from Joshua to the first king of the Hebrews, the first king of Israel. What the story takes place is pretty much, there was the famine in the land where the Hebrew children were. There was a woman by the name of Naomi. She left with her family to Moab. There's these surrounding territories surrounding Judah, Egypt, the Hittites, Midianites, Moab, and all of these like different types of pagan cultures. And Israel that were very pagan and had all of these different types of rituals, right? And so they kept being tempted to practice some of these things that God had strictly told them was forbidden. And because of that, God would, curse the land and pretty much curse the work of their hands, just like Moses described in the book of Deuteronomy, which there was famine also. And so Naomi and her family left the territory, the regions where the Hebrews dwelt, for Moab, which was on the other side of the Dead Sea, which was a neighboring bordering territory. Their god was Chemosh. Okay. The story of Ruth is actually King David's prequel, right? So David will come out of this line of actually Moabites. So Naaman goes to Moab because there's a famine, and Moab is very fertile, and there's a lot of like water and greenage and there's a lot of great agriculture. So they're there. I don't know how long, I think for 10 years total. So she has two sons that she's takes with her, and the two sons each marry Moabite women, which is already right part of the commands to not marry foreigners, because God says that they will pretty much convince you to worship other gods, because he literally says they will give you pleasure at first, but then they will turn against you and harm you. Which I think is so prolific, because a lot of people don't really understand, like when the Bible tells us not to get into divination and to these different types of versions of witchcraft, and even like astrology, yoga, all these different types of things. They're beneficial at first, right? Mediums, right? They'll tell you what you want to hear at first. Everything is going great, but that's only to lure you in, right? And their ultimate goal is to kill you spiritually and to kill you physically before receiving salvation. Obviously, salvation is newer when it comes to the timeline of the Bible. But in those days, before that, they want to kill you spiritually and kill you physically before you were able to repent and turn back to the Lord, tear down your altars and throw away all of your, crystals and your symbolisms. And your attachment. What ends up happening is Naomi goes over to Moab. Moab actually, honestly, the way it even started is, if you remember the story of Abraham had a nephew named Lot, and he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah. So we all know the story. So when the angels went in to get Lot, it was like completely wicked, and Lot and his family were actually the only ones that came out. And actually Lot's wife is the one who turned into the pillar of salt. So Lot and his two daughters end up pretty much it's just them three, and they end up going to a mountain and living, because like everywhere else was like kind of weird. So they end up going to live like kind of by a mountain, and the daughters pretty much get their dad drunk and they each sleep with him, because they have no one to procreate with, right? Which procreation obviously back then was like really, really important. And so they get pregnant by their dad, and one of the children's name is Moab, and the other one is Ami. Those two boys grow and multiply and become the Moabites and the Ammonites, right? So this is territory of Moab, and Moab was able to multiply and grow while the Hebrews were in Egypt. So that 400 years, they were literally just like growing and flourishing or whatever. Now Naomi goes over to Moab during this time in the book of Judges, where everything was just like crazy and falling apart. Her two sons marry Moabite women, which, like I said, is already against the command. So, right, her two sons die. And honestly, I think her husband dies too. So it doesn't really say why, but for me, it kind of also goes into the commandments of the Lord, right? The blessings and the curses. And I believe it's somewhere it said something about like you not reaching a fullness of life, like you're gonna die young, like you're gonna die prematurely, like you're not going to reach the apex of your life, right? Grandsons die, and she's like, okay, well, this isn't good. She's been there 10 years. She decides to go back to her land, the land where the Hebrew children are. So her daughter-in-laws are following her. Eventually, one of them goes back, Ophrah. She ends up going back to, wherever her parents are from. And Ruth which is the name of this book, she decides to stay with Naomi and pretty much says, I'm going to go wherever you're going to go. But Naomi tries to convince her not to come because she's like, I have no more sons for you. Like, even if I had a kid right now, are you going to wait till he becomes, you know, an adult? Like, no, you wouldn't do that. Naomi must have had an impact on her because she was just like, I'm going to go with you no matter what. Now, matter of fact, Devon Franklin has a film on Netflix, I believe, with Tyler Perry. Oh no, it's called Ruth and Boaz, but I haven't seen it. And honestly, from the trailer, it looked nothing like Ruth and Boaz. But you know, sometimes there's a contemporary ways to tell a old story or a traditional story. So I don't know if anybody's seen it. You guys can let me know. But Naomi just was like, okay, whatever. She lets Ruth go with her. So Ruth comes back to Hebrew land, right? Hebrew territory, where the other Hebrew children are, and everybody kind of notices that, she's different. Like, oh, she's a Moabite. And honestly, the Moabites and like the Hebrews at this point, they were very familiar with each other, a little too familiar with each other. Because even at the end of the book of Numbers, the Hebrew men, couldn't stay away from those foreign women. And the women were able to convince them to party with them at their sacrificial parties. Their food was dedicated to other gods. They were dedicated to Chemosh, that god who enjoys human sacrifice, child sacrifice, bestiality, incest, drugs. Moab was very much a large producer of wine and alcohol and stuff like that. And so they invited them to come over.
So another thing I forgot to mention, because a lot is going on, I'm trying to quickly catch up on these reflections, is that when the Hebrew children, the Hebrew men started to these ritual festivals with the Moabite women, God released a plague in the Hebrew camp. And as you know, that was like about 100,000 people or so, maybe more. And so a plague would be released, and it's also what we talked about in our other reflections. Sin and disease go hand in hand. And we can see that often in the Old Testament, how in society, if we look around and see so much disease, we also know that our society is morally bankrupt, right? We're spiritually ill. And spiritual illness leads to physical sickness. I thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing is if you look in the text, it says because they were going to these festivals and the food they ate were dedicated to other gods, and the music and everything was dedicated to these other gods, that the Hebrew children yoked themselves to the god of Peor. Okay, when we do yoga, we are bowing down to these gods, right? These Hindu gods. Therefore, we are yoking ourselves to these gods. If you see the signs that say halal, make sure that you're not actually eating the halal, that it just says there's a halal option, right? Because then we yoke ourselves to Allah. Islam dedicates their meat to Allah. And so when we say festivals, we don't just mean ancient festivals. They're going to clearly have demon or pitchfork and horns. They're going to clearly have fire. They're going to clearly be promoting low vibrational satanic things like sex and drugs and murder. No, we're not talking about ancient festivals only. We're talking about the modern day pop, rap culture, the music industry, the film industry, concert industry, which most people don't know. You're still going to rituals, you're still going to festivals that are dedicated to these artist gods. The music they are recording is dedicated and inspired by their gods. Anything that you do for another god, you yoke yourself. What does yoke mean? It means you literally bind yourself to that god. Wow, how scary is that?
One time Moses, literally the guys were sneaking the girls back to their tents. So that's what I'm saying. Anybody who's oh, the Bible's out, it's literally, if you read it, it's the exact same game plan. YN sneaking foreign girls back to their tents where they definitely do not need to be. Literally, I think somebody in the Hebrew tent like stabbed one of the girls who was like walking by. They're like, I know this uncircumcised Moabite is not up in our tents. So actually, I think one of them got killed at the Hebrew camp. So this is the backstory. Yeah, so Naomi goes over there, loses her sons, and then Ruth follows her back to Hebrew land, Hebrew territory. She's living with Naomi, and the person's land who she happens to be working on is named Boaz. Boaz is a relative of Naomi. And pretty much, long story short, like, Boaz was like feeling Ruth and would like say stuff here and there, but like obviously you have to read it contextually. And if you know when a guy is trying to hit on you, like when he's being extra nice and saying extra nice things. And so Ruth would tell Naomi like, oh yeah, like he like did this and said this. And I think Naomi was more like, this may just work out. So Naomi would kind of tell Ruth how to play it, but not play it. You know what I'm saying? Like, okay, well, this is what we do in our culture. Like, do this and do that. And it would like help Boaz kind of get the hint that like Ruth was up for grabs, and that she was available. He pretty much was like, in order for me to get Ruth, I would have to buy this land because she lives on this property that's for sale or something, or because she's like a widow and there's this like order of like who gets to marry the widow after, the person's gone. And I think somebody else was actually in line to marry her, but not in line, like when you go look at the court records and you're like, oh, well, it says that like if it's like inheritance, who's the next to inherit. And so which I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's so misogynist, but not really, because like it's somebody was always going to be taking care of the woman. Like that's literally how it was set up, and so they were just like, okay, so this woman needs a husband, pretty much is what they were looking at. And they were trying to figure out who was the next person. And it was somebody else, but Boaz really liked her. And so he like kind of was like, oh, well, or like, oh, this property is like up for sale, but it comes with the widow. And so anybody who's going to take this land also is required to care after the widow because she has nobody to carry on the legacy of her, deceased husband. But if nobody's willing to do it, I would definitely be responsible for the land. I could keep up the land and I would take care of the widow and be sure that we continue the legacy of her husband and keep the name going. And the other guys were like, I don't think they knew at first, I don't think they really knew that Boaz liked her like that, because the way it's written, you can tell he was really like kind of matter of fact and like was trying to keep it like, yeah, well, this is just the right thing to do. I guess I'll do it. But if you know, okay? If you're Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz knew what was going on. But there was a way they had to do it, right? Because sometimes when you let other people know what you want, then other people are going to try to get it. So I feel like play it where it was like, he didn't make it obvious that he actually wanted her. So, yeah, so this was during the time of Judges, which also there was this judge that I didn't mention there because there was 12 of them named Ehud. There was a judge named Ehud, and he was known for being left-handed. That part of the chapter in Judges starts out with, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, which is a common theme in the book of Judges. The Lord gave King Eglon the power over the Hebrew children. And if you remember what I said is that Moab was very pagan. They worshipped Chemosh, the god called Chemosh. He was human sacrifice, bestiality, incest, divination, passing through the fire, cannibalism, drinking blood, all that. all that. Okay. God hated the Chemosh gods so much that he literally says that the Moabites are not allowed in the temple up until the 10th generation, because when Joshua was trying to conquer Canaan, he had to cross through Moab, and the Moabites like didn't want to let them cross. The king was like, I don't even know who you guys are, and like, no, you can't cross. And in fact, the king tried to set them up and got a pagan prophet, the prophet of Peor, to curse them because they were trying to cross through his land. And the prophet, I think his name was Balaam, he literally said that he could not curse them. He couldn't if he tried. And in fact, he gave them a blessing because he couldn't curse them. He could only bless them. And it said that God gave the Hebrew children over to him because they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now I'm getting to my point. The point of me saying that is because when we see in the book of Judges, do you see how God uses wicked people to even pass his judgment on those who are supposed to be righteous, right? You know, even God's chosen people still are going to be overthrown by people who aren't even part of the covenant, the uncircumcised, right? The pagans. And so, but we also see God using the righteous, the chosen, to pass his judgment on the wicked. This is really important because I know a lot of people question why certain things happen. Why would God allow these people to be oppressed, or why would God allow this country to be destroyed? I think it goes back to what happens in the Old Testament, where there was infidelity with God. There was either rebellion, a group of people who may have never heard of him or his commandments. Their religion, their spirituality causes them to be morally wicked, that he uses those under his covenant to pass his judgment on them, you know. And it literally goes back and forth. So it also brings me to the point in Joshua where Joshua's about to fight back. He's about to run back up on all of these kingdoms who, like, you know, surrounded him on the battlefield, and he sees an angel, but he doesn't know it's an angel. It's just like a guy. And he said, are you for us or are you against us? He says, neither. I am the commander, the angel of the Lord. I've heard the saying, and we've all heard the saying, like, whose side is God on? But the reality is like, are you on God's side? God doesn't pick sides. He picks himself, and you need to choose him. And so as long as you choose him, no matter where he goes, you're going to be covered and protected. And so she and Boaz eventually get married. They have a baby, and this is the beginning of the lineage of King David. So the story's not overly interesting, but the reason why we tell this story, and I believe the reason why the Bible tells the story, is the Bible meticulously, chronologically details where everybody is coming from. Boaz and Ruth gave birth to Obed. Obed had Jesse. Jesse had 7 sons, and the 7th one was David, the shepherd boy. David had Solomon, okay? And so the succession of the Hebrew kings begins, okay? All right, so that was really it. It was a very quick reflection, probably the quickest reflection I have done to date. It's a very small chapter. It's a very simple story, but it's important because this is the prequel to David and Solomon, the greatest kings that Israel has had. All of the stories that we'll start seeing in the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. But it was very important because it is where we get King David, and knowing that he comes from a Moabite woman, even though the Moabites did not follow the commandments and actually God hated their God, he didn't hate their people, if that makes sense. David's great grandmother is a Moabite. So that just is a testament to God and his love for mankind and humanity. And at the end of the day, they are his children as well. And so the next reflection is the book of Samuel. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are coming up. And don't forget to read the Bible. Bye.